I would like to begin the class by pointing out something which is not frequently discussed by students and teachers, and that is the extraordinary pictorial quality of Tennyson's poetry. In Tennyson's poetry, we repeatedly come across wonderful pictures, striking pictures, which are indelibly recorded in the mind of the reader. And these pictures, which are embedded in Tennyson's poetry, including in Memoriam A.H.H, were a source of inspiration to the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. And the pre-Raphaelite artists created many immortal paintings based on Tennyson's poetry, inspired by Tennyson's poetry. This is an excellent example of how art forms influence one another, how a verbal art form, poetry, exerts a remarkable influence on a visual art form, painting. Canto 71 continues the sleep motif, the dream motif. At last, the poet is able to see a dream of extraordinary clarity, of rich detail. The dream is based on the past, of course. The poet dreams that he goes to France with Helen, and the fact is that he had indeed gone to France one summer with Helen, and the canto provides the details of what they saw in France, what they experienced in France, and these include the river, the woods, the fortress, the mountain ridge, the waterfall, the bridge, the waves on the beach. The poet asks sleep, which has brought down his friend from heaven, to complete his happiness by removing the haunting sense of loss associated with the death of Helen that refuses to leave him, whether he is asleep or awake. In Canto 72, the poet bids goodbye to the dream motif, the sleep motif. The dreams are over. It is the day on which Helen died. The poet remembers the day as the day on which his crowned estate, his life's happiness began to fail, affecting everything around him. The flowers, the blooms, the sun, the rose, the daisy, the rain, everything around him was adversely affected. The poet remembers the day as a disastrous day, marked with some hideous crime, a shameful day, the day on which Hallam breathed his last. This canto is a good exemplification of Tennyson's work as a nature poet. Tennyson is a great nature poet. This is something I keep on repeating, and I shall be discussing Tennyson as a nature poet after some time, in some detail after some time. For now, I would like to point out that We get brilliant glimpses of nature, English nature in this canto. And these glimpses include glimpses of the daisy, the rose, the sun, the poplar, the wind, the moon, the trees. What more can you ask for? Canto 73 can be called the reconciliation canto. The poet makes an effort to reconcile with what has happened. The canto reminds one of the old Greek saying, whom the gods love, die young. Whom the gods love, die young. There is no doubt, says the poet, that Hallam died remarkably early. He has gone to some other world to work there. Had he lived long enough, he would have attained fame. It was clear that Hallam was meant for great things. But the poet refuses to quarrel with nature's law. There is a divine scheme of things which we ought not question. It is true that if Hallam had lived long enough, he would have achieved fame. But what after all is fame? Fame on earth is illusory. What matters is the soul. And the soul of Hallam has been transported from this world to another world. The soul of Hallam is meant for doing great things in that world. What matters ultimately is the divine, is the spiritual. Everything rests with God. Thus, the poet makes an attempt to reconcile himself to the laws of Hallam, trying to believe that something positive, something good would, would come out of this terrible tragedy. The mood of reconciliation is continued in Canto 74. The poet says that he is grateful to death for one particular thing. Death has revealed to him the kinship of the dead man with the great men of the past. I repeat, death has revealed to the poet the kinship of the dead man with the great men of the past. In the face of his dead friend, the poet sees not merely his dead friend, he sees something of the ever developing soul, of the ever evolving soul. He sees something of the kinship that the dead man has with the great men, with the wise men of the past. The reconciliation process is taken further forward in Canto 75. The poet says that no language can truly express the praises that should be showered upon Hallam. Hence, the poet refuses to praise Hallam. The poet leaves them unexpressed. The best way to praise the remarkable qualities of Hallam is to remain silent. This world cares only for actual performances. There is the unsaid argument that this world refuses to take into consideration the fact that Hallam died long before his prime. Hallam did not achieve much in concrete terms because he died too early. But this world is not so much concerned with such things. This world wants actual achievement, actual achievement. The possible powers, the potential of the man. These are things which do not attract the attention, do not attract the praise of this world. Hallam was meant for great things, but the world refuses to acknowledge this. Hallam has now gone to another world. In that world, these powers now have full scope for activity and a full measure of fame. In Canto 76, the poet says that space and time are infinite. Before the infinity of space and time, the fame of a poet shrinks into nothing. The life of a poem is brief. It is shorter than even the life of a tree. In front of the infinity of space and time, the fame of a poet is insignificant. It shrinks into nothingness. It pales into insignificance. In this canto, Tennyson says that space and time are infinite, and that before the infinity of space and time, the fame of a poet contracts into nothingness. I would like to work out a contrast between this canto and William Shakespeare's famous Sonnet 55. This is how the sonnet opens. I quote from memory, and I hope I'm right. I think I am. I quote, "Not marble, nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme." Unquote. I shall repeat the passage. Not marble, nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. In Canto 77, the poet says that these songs, like all human achievements, will ultimately dwindle into littleness. It appears that the poet does not have high hopes about the worth, the immortality of his work, of In Memoriam A.H.H in particular. The poet says that with the passage of time, his songs will die and escape human memory. His poems will be forgotten, and the leaves of his books may be used as waste paper. However, all this will not make him abandon his project of writing poems. He will continue to sing, not because he desires fame, but because he wants to utter love, but because he wants to express his love for his friend. I would like to work out a comparison between Canto 77 and what is inscribed on the tombstone of John Keats. Poets are often worried about whether they will be remembered by posterity. And in moods of despair, when despair overwhelms them, they think that they will be completely forgotten by the ages to come. I think that it is in such a mood that Lord Tennyson wrote Canto 77. As I said, a comparison can be established between Canto 77 of In Memoriam A.H.H and the epitaph inscribed on the tombstone of John Keats. John Keats, as you know, breathed his last in Rome and was buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. On the basis of his specific request, it was inscribed on his tombstone the following line: "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." I repeat, here lies one whose name was writ in water. Canto 78 tells us that it is Christmas once again. There is a quiet sense of loss, but there is no expression of distress, no tears, no shocking signs of pain, no dark shadow of death. This does not mean that the grief is dead. The grief lives, though the tears have dried up. Perhaps the grief can never die. The poet explains that the sorrow does not die, but is diffused through the whole substance of life. Sorrow does not die in the heart, does not die in the depths of the heart, but only her surface indications evaporate. Only the tears dry up. In Canto 79, the poet says that Hallam was to him more than his brothers. This is because Hallam was very different from Tennyson, and there was a sort of symbiotic relationship between Hallam and Tennyson. It is true that Hallam and Tennyson were molded in the same mint. They exposed themselves to the same experiences of nature. They read the same lessons. Still, Hallam was very different from Tennyson. There was much in Hallam which was not present in Tennyson. And so, Tennyson could expect from Hallam what he could not expect from his own brothers. Let us take a look at the last stanza of the canto. But he was rich where I was poor, and he supplied my want the more, as his unlikeness fitted mine. How Hallam had in him what was not found in Tennyson. The word rich need not be interpreted in a very literal sense. The word rich need not be interpreted in a financial sense. Of course, Hallam was from a much more well off family than the Tennysons. But the word rich should be given a wide semantic significance. Hallam was rich in those things that Tennyson was poor, and those things could be literary things, cultural things, social things, and spiritual things. Since Hallam was dramatically different from Tennyson in many respects, Tennyson could expect to be sustained by the literary, social, cultural, spiritual resources of Hallam. In Canto 80, the poet gives his imagination a free rein. What has happened now? Hallam died. Tennyson mourns his loss. What would have happened if the situation had been reversed? What would have happened if Tennyson had died instead of Hallam? How would Hallam have taken it? There is no doubt that Hallam would have been filled with grief as a result of the death of Tennyson. But there is also the fact that though the grief would be deep, though the grief would be deep, a grief as deep as life or thought, Hallam's innate spiritual strength would have sustained him. Hallam's profound faith in God, Hallam's profound faith in the law of nature would have sustained him. There is no doubt that he would have sorrowed, but it would have been a sorrow tempered by a great peace, a great spiritual peace, born out of profound understanding. The poet says that he imagines the sentences that Hallam would speak on the death of Tennyson. I hear the sentence that he speaks. He bears the burthen of the weeks, but turns his burthen into gain. In his imagination, the poet sees Hallam uttering the sentences he would utter on the death of Tennyson. He sorrows for weeks, he carries the burden of sorrow for weeks, but he also manages to convert his grief into loss, his burden into loss. This is an unused example because it is not Tennyson who has died, it is Hallam who has died. But the poet uses this unused example to comfort himself. He draws inspiration from the example of Hallam, who had great faith in God, tremendous faith in God, who enjoyed a spiritual peace in his heart. And Tennyson draws inspiration from Hallam and comforts himself. Critic after critic has praised the remarkable powers of imagination of Tennyson, how Tennyson is capable of allowing his fancy a free flight in his poetry, how in the matter of imagination Tennyson is few peers in English poetry. And these remarkable powers of imagination, these splendid powers of imagination are very much visible, are fully visible in this canto.